My mother-in-law tried to spoil my anniversary party by announcing her pregnancy news with her medical reports. But when I saw the report, I couldn't control my laughter. My husband asked, "Why are you laughing so crazily?" I simply showed him the report and he also started laughing because the report she was showing was actually. The house was the only thing that felt truly hers. Eleanor had spent the last 4 years living in the home her mother had secured before she passed away. A place untouched by the influence of her father or his new family. It was more than just walls and a roof. It was a reminder that her mother had thought of her future, had made sure she had something of her own. Her father had walked out when she was 9, leaving behind nothing but broken promises and a deep sense of abandonment. He had remarried soon after, starting a new family as if Eleanor had never existed. Over the years, their relationship had withered into occasional, strained conversations, mostly out of obligation rather than any real desire to reconnect. His wife, Laura, had never made an effort to hide her disdain for Eleanor. In her eyes, Eleanor was nothing more than an inconvenience, a remnant of the past that didn't fit into the perfect world she had built with Eleanor's father. So when Laura reached out unexpectedly, pretending to extend an olive branch, Eleanor was immediately suspicious. She had learned long ago that kindness from Laura always came with an ulterior motive. This time was no different. Laura invited Eleanor to lunch at an upscale restaurant, the kind of place Laura thrived in, where wealth and status spoke louder than words. Sitting across from her, Eleanor kept her expression neutral, waiting for the real reason behind the sudden invitation. It didn't take long for Laura to get to the point. "There are some legal documents regarding the family trust fund," Laura said smoothly, sliding a folder across the table. "It's just a formality, really. A quick signature, and we can make sure everything remains in order." Eleanor hesitated before picking up the papers. The wording was complicated, but something felt off. She wasn't an expert in legal matters, but her gut told her this wasn't just a simple signature. "What exactly am I signing?" she asked, glancing up at Laura. Laura smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's just to finalize some adjustments in the fund. Nothing to worry about." Eleanor wasn't convinced. She scanned the document more carefully, her stomach tightening as certain phrases stood out. Reallocation of assets, transfer of beneficiary rights. She didn't know the full extent of what Laura was trying to pull, but one thing was clear. Laura wanted her to sign away something valuable, and she was trying to make sure Eleanor didn't realize it. Eleanor set the papers down. "I'll need some time to look this over." Laura's expression faltered for a brief second before she quickly masked it with another smile. "Of course, but don't take too long. These things need to be handled quickly." Eleanor nodded, but she already knew one thing for sure. She wasn't signing anything without finding out exactly what was going on. If Laura was trying to manipulate her, there had to be more to this trust fund than she realized, and Eleanor intended to find out the truth. Eleanor sat across from James Harrison, a well-respected lawyer known for his integrity. She had reached out to him after her unsettling lunch with Laura, needing someone who could help her understand the legal jargon in the documents. Now, as he flipped through the papers, his expression grew more serious with each passing minute. "This isn't just a simple adjustment," James finally said, setting the documents down. "Laura is trying to transfer a significant portion of the trust fund's assets. If you had signed this, you would have given up most of your legal claim." Eleanor's heart pounded. But why? What has she gained from this? James leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "That's what we need to find out. If she's making these changes now, chances are there's already been some financial manipulation. We'll have to dig deeper into the records." The next few days were a blur of bank statements, trust fund reports, and financial documents James had managed to obtain. Eleanor had never cared much about numbers, but as she sat beside James, poring over the records, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. Laura had been siphoning money from the trust fund for years, rerouting it through various accounts, disguising the transactions under false expenses. What was even worse, Michael, her stepbrother, had been receiving large sums directly from these diverted funds. Eleanor stared at the evidence in disbelief. Michael knew about this. James exhaled sharply. Judging by these transfers, he didn't just know he benefited from it. "He's been receiving payments disguised as investments from the trust. Your stepmother has ensured that you're left with almost nothing." Eleanor clenched her fists, rage bubbling inside her. Michael had always been their father's favorite. He got everything. The attention, the opportunities, the resources. And now, he was taking what little she had left. "She always made me feel like an outsider," Eleanor muttered, her voice laced with anger. "And now she's trying to erase me completely." James nodded. "This isn't just about money. It's about control. If you don't fight back, she wins." Eleanor looked down at the documents, her mind racing. She had spent her whole life being overlooked, pushed aside, but this was different. This was theft, and she wasn't going to let them get away with it. Eleanor sat in her dimly lit living room, James's words echoing in her mind. If you don't fight back, she wins. The evidence was clear. Laura had been stealing from the trust fund, and Michael had been enjoying the benefits. Exposing them would mean legal consequences, scandal, and possibly even prison time. But it would also mean destroying what little was left of her family. Her father, the man who had walked away from her life without looking back. Did she owe him anything? And Michael, he had never treated her like a real sister, always taking what he wanted without a second thought. But was she ready to be the reason their lives fell apart? James had told her the right thing to do. Take legal action. He made it sound simple, logical. But this wasn't just about money or fraud. This was about years of resentment, neglect, and betrayal. Was this justice, or was it revenge? Eleanor needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to her. Laura barely reacted when Eleanor stormed into her house, gripping the financial documents in her hand. She was seated on a sleek leather couch, sipping wine as if nothing in the world could touch her. "I know what you did," Eleanor said, throwing the papers onto the coffee table. "You stole from the trust. You left me with nothing while you funnel money to Michael and yourself." Laura glanced at the documents, then looked up, unfazed. "You're being dramatic." Eleanor clenched her jaw. "These aren't accusations. This is proof." Laura sighed and set down her glass. "And what exactly do you plan to do with this proof? Take me to court? Ruin your father's reputation? You think he'll take your side?" Eleanor hesitated. Laura noticed and smiled. "That's what I thought," she said smoothly. "Your father has always chosen us over you. Do you really think that will change now? If you go public with this, you'll only make yourself the enemy." Eleanor's hands trembled, but she stood her ground. "This isn't just about him. This is about what's right." Laura leaned forward, her expression darkening. "Let me give you a piece of advice, dear. The world doesn't reward righteousness. It rewards power, and I have far more of it than you do." The threat was clear, but before Eleanor could respond, a voice spoke from the doorway. "Laura, stop." Eleanor turned to see Michael standing there, his face pale. He looked between them, then let out a slow breath. She deserves to know the truth. Laura shot him a warning glare, but Michael ignored it. He looked at Eleanor, guilt flickering in his eyes. "There's more to this than you think," he admitted. "Something you don't know." Eleanor's heart pounded. "Then tell me." Michael hesitated, then said something that made her entire world shift beneath her feet. Eleanor felt like the walls were closing in around her. Michael's words had shaken her, but he hadn't given her the full truth. Not yet. That meant one thing. She had to find it herself. She spent the next few days locked in her late mother's study, going through every financial document, every legal paper she could get her hands on. With James's help, she tracked down older records, ones that predated Laura's involvement in the family's finances. What she found made her stomach drop. Laura hadn't just stolen from the trust fund, she had taken Eleanor's rightful inheritance. Her mother had left behind a significant sum of money, enough to secure Eleanor's future, but that money had never reached her. Instead, it had been rerouted, buried under fake transactions and false legal claims. And the worst part? Her father had signed off on it. Eleanor sat frozen, staring at the documents spread across the table. It wasn't just Laura, it was him too. He had known. He had watched as his daughter's future was taken away and had done nothing to stop it. James leaned against the desk beside her. "Your mother's estate was supposed to be protected under a separate account, but the money was funneled into the family trust, which Laura then drained." Eleanor shook her head, struggling to breathe. "And my father?" James hesitated. "Based on these signatures, he allowed it to happen. Maybe he was manipulated, maybe he wanted to keep peace in his new marriage, but he didn't stop it." Eleanor felt her nails dig into her palms. She had spent years blaming Laura for the way her father had abandoned her, for how she had been cast aside. But now the truth was staring her in the face. He hadn't just left her behind, he had let them take what was hers. She pushed away from the desk, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I need to hear it from him." Eleanor's father looked older than she remembered. His once confident posture had sagged, and there was a tiredness in his eyes when he opened the door. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "Eleanor," he said, his voice cautious. "Come in." She stepped inside, her fingers tightening around the folder of documents. "I know what you did." He inhaled sharply but didn't deny it. Instead, he closed the door and sighed. "So you found out." Eleanor's throat tightened. "So you found out." Not "I'm sorry." Not "I can explain." Just a quiet confirmation of guilt. "You let Laura steal my mother's inheritance," she said, her voice shaking with restrained fury. "You signed away my future." He ran a hand down his face, looking away. "It wasn't that simple." "Then explain it to me," she snapped. "Explain how you let your wife take everything my mother left for me. Explain how you stood by and did nothing while she funneled money into Michael's future while leaving me with nothing." Her father let out a slow breath. I thought it was best for the family. Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. What family? You mean Laura and Michael? Because you certainly weren't thinking about me. His face contorted with something she couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe? Shame? But it didn't matter. Not anymore. I can't change the past, Eleanor, he said finally. But if this goes public, it will ruin everything. It will tear this family apart. Eleanor stared at him, realization washing over her like a cold wave. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't even denying what he had done. He just wanted her to stay silent. Laura had threatened her. Her father was pleading with her. But in the end, they wanted the same thing. For her to disappear. For her to let it go. For her to walk away, like she always had. But this time, she wasn't sure she could. Eleanor sat on the porch of her mother's house, staring blankly at the horizon. The papers detailing the fraud were in her lap, but she couldn't bring herself to look at them again. She had spent years believing that her father had simply moved on, that Laura was the sole villain in her story. But, now she knew better. He had chosen silence. He had let them take everything from her. She clenched her fists. Was this about revenge? Or, was it about doing what was right? Inside, James sat at the kitchen table, watching her through the window. He had seen this kind of hesitation before, the moment when morality and emotion clashed, when justice felt too heavy to carry. After a while, he stepped outside and leaned against the railing. You're thinking about letting this go, aren't you? Eleanor exhaled sharply, shaking her head. I don't know. If I expose them, I destroy my father's life. Michael's too. No matter how awful they've been to me, I can't pretend that doesn't matter. James folded his arms. You're not the one destroying them. They did that themselves when they stole from you. She pressed her fingers to her temples. But what if it backfires? What if I go through all of this and nothing happens? What if I lose? James sighed. Look, I get it. You've been fighting for scraps of love from a family that never really made space for you. But, your mother did. She fought for you even when she was gone. She left you this house, this inheritance, because she wanted you to be secure. He gestured toward the papers in her lap. And they took that from you. You think staying silent will fix anything? They'll just keep doing it, to you, or to someone else. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. She wanted to believe that standing up for herself wouldn't just be an act of revenge, that it could be something more. James leaned in slightly, his voice softer now. What would your mother want you to do? Eleanor's chest tightened. She thought of her mother's warm eyes, the way she had always reassured her that she was loved, that she mattered. She had fought so hard to give Eleanor a future, and Laura had ripped it away like it was nothing. Her mother wouldn't have stayed silent. Eleanor looked up at James. If I do this, I need to be ready for war. James gave a small nod. Then let's prepare. The next day, Eleanor took a deep breath and walked into her father's office. He was sitting behind his desk, paperwork neatly stacked in front of him. When he saw her, his face shifted into something between surprise and weariness. Eleanor, he said cautiously, what are you doing here? She placed the documents on his desk. I'm giving you one chance to make this right. He glanced at the papers, his jaw tightening. I told you to leave this alone. She folded her arms. And, I told you I wouldn't. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. Do you have any idea what you're doing? If this goes public, it won't just affect Laura. It will ruin everything. My business, my reputation, your brother's future. Michael made his choices. Eleanor interrupted. So did you. Her father rubbed his temple. This isn't just about the money, Eleanor. This is about family. She let out a bitter laugh. Family? You're only saying that because I finally have something you don't want me to use. She straightened. You don't get to manipulate me into silence. Not anymore. His face darkened. And, what do you think you'll gain from this? Revenge? Eleanor shook her head. Justice. She turned and walked away, leaving him in stunned silence. She didn't need his approval anymore. For the first time in her life, she was fighting for herself. Eleanor stood in front of the courthouse, the cool morning air biting against her skin. The press had already gathered, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping with questions. She could feel her heart pounding, but she forced herself to stand tall. This was it, the moment she had chosen to fight back. James stood beside her, a steady presence in the storm. He had spent the last week preparing her for this, making sure every document, every piece of evidence was solid. There was no turning back now. She stepped forward, clearing her throat. I'm here today because my stepmother, Laura Mitchell, has committed financial fraud, stealing money from the family trust and manipulating legal documents for her own gain. My father, whether through negligence or intent, allowed it to happen. And today, I'm making sure they face the consequences. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Reporters fired questions at her, asking about her father, about Michael, about the legal proceedings. She didn't flinch. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the people who had been wronged, who had been silenced. Inside the courthouse, Laura sat at the defendant's table, her usual cold confidence now replaced with a mask of quiet fury. Eleanor could see it in her eyes, the barely restrained anger, the realization that she had lost control. Michael sat a few rows behind, his face pale, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench. He had spent years looking the other way, pretending their family wasn't built on deception. But now, there was no escaping it. The trial moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, testimonies from those Laura had manipulated. Even her father, when forced to take the stand, couldn't deny what had happened. His silence spoke louder than any excuse he could have made. And, Michael, he looked broken. For years, he had lived in the illusion that Laura and their father had only ever done what was necessary to protect the family. But now, watching the truth unravel in front of him, he couldn't hide behind that anymore. When the verdict came, it was swift. Laura was convicted of fraud and embezzlement. Her assets were frozen. She would face prison time. The empire she had built on lies was gone. Outside the courtroom, Eleanor let out a slow breath, exhaustion finally catching up to her. James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. She nodded, but the weight of it all still pressed against her chest. Michael approached hesitantly. His usual smugness was gone. "Eleanor," he started, but then hesitated, as if he didn't even know what to say. She met his gaze, waiting. I didn't know how bad it was," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have listened to you." Eleanor studied him, trying to find any trace of the brother she had wanted him to be. Maybe for the first time he was being honest. "It's too late for regrets, Michael," she said. But her voice wasn't cruel, just tired. "You have to live with what you chose." He looked away, nodding slightly, and then walked off, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his own guilt. Eleanor turned to James. "It's over." James gave a small smile. "Now, it's just the beginning." And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt free. Eleanor sat in her mother's house, her house now. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden hue over the hardwood floors. For the first time, the space didn't feel haunted by the past. It felt like a beginning. The legal battle had been exhausting, but she had won. Laura was behind bars. The fraudulent accounts had been frozen, and after months of court proceedings, Eleanor had reclaimed what was rightfully hers. The inheritance her mother had left her was no longer tainted by Laura's greed. Her father had tried to reach out, of course. At first, with feigned concern, messages about how they could fix this and find a way to move forward as a family. But as soon as it became clear that Eleanor wouldn't back down, his tone had changed. His last voicemail had been cold. "You think you've won, Eleanor? You've destroyed this family." She had deleted it without listening to the rest. Michael had disappeared from her life too. After the trial, he had made a weak attempt at an apology, but Eleanor knew it wasn't about her. It was about his own guilt, about trying to make peace with the fact that he had stood by and let it all happen. She wasn't angry anymore, not at him, not at her father. She was just done. James knocked on the doorframe, breaking her from her thoughts. "So, what now?" he asked, stepping inside. Eleanor leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "I don't know. For the first time, I don't have to fight. I don't have to prove anything to anyone. I can just live." He smiled. "That's a pretty good place to start." She nodded, exhaling slowly. "I think I'll sell this place," she admitted. "Not because I don't love it, but because I want something that's mine, not just something I inherited from the past." James raised an eyebrow. "Any idea where you'll go?" Eleanor grinned. "Somewhere new. Somewhere I don't have to be Eleanor Mitchell, the girl who exposed her family's crimes. Just Eleanor." James laughed. "I like that." He studied her for a moment. "You know, not many people would have done what you did. It took guts." She met his gaze. "I didn't do it because I was brave," she admitted. "I did it because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't." James nodded. "That's what makes you different from them." Eleanor glanced around the house one last time. The memories of her mother would always be here, but they weren't tied to the walls or the furniture. They were in her heart in the lessons she had learned, and that was enough. She grabbed her keys and turned to James. "Come on. Let's go see what the world has to offer." As she stepped outside, she felt lighter than she had in years. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning.